أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا إنه من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay, quick recap from last time. So, we're reaching the end of the Prophet's life, and we covered last time the conquest of Mecca. Before the conquest of Mecca was one last battle that the Prophet didn't participate in, but he sent an army out to sort of bring to control, put under the control of the Muslims, some certain tribes in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. This was the Battle of Seerah Lesson. It was notable because it was put under the leadership of Amr ibn al-As. Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As, who had been a recent convert. He was probably only a few weeks after he had converted to Islam. In the army, initially 300 strong, the Prophet placed some of the highest rankings of the Sahaba, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Umar, Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, radiallahu anhum, and they were put under the leadership of Amr ibn al-As. He was a recent convert. So these were people in the army. They have been Muslims, some of them from the very beginning. They were more knowledgeable about Islam than Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As. But of course, each person has different capabilities. So Sayyidina Amr was probably a better military leader compared to some of the other Sahaba that he led. They led the army. Sayyidina Amr led the army through the desert, but only travelled by night. He forbade anybody from lighting fires at night, and there were a number of things that the people actually complained to the Prophet about Sayyidina Amr. One of them was, I said, they were prohibited from lighting fires at night, and they needed the fires, number one, to keep warm because of the cold climate at night. Fires maybe to cooking food maybe, I'm not sure. But the other things that they complained about were, for example, that Sayyidina Amr insisted on leading the army in prayer. Even though some of the people behind him were more knowledgeable, they had been Muslims for longer than him. Another time that he led the morning prayer, the Fajr prayer, he led the prayer even though he was impure. He had slept, he woke up in a state of impurity, he needed to wash his body. Instead of washing his body, he just did tayammum and led the whole army in prayer. He was the imam. So tayammum is wudu, but without water, using sand or physical objects. So you just wipe your hands and wipe your body with it afterwards. So after the campaign was the successful campaign, the army returned back to Medina, and of course there were the complaints. So the Prophet summoned Sayyidina Amr and asked him, "Why did you do this and this?" He said, "Yes, I did." And he explained himself. He said, "I prohibited people from lighting fires at night because I didn't want to give my position away to the enemy." He wanted to travel in secret. He didn't want the enemy to find out. He wanted the element of surprise so he could attack the enemy, so the enemy wouldn't have time to prepare themselves. That's number one. Number two is he led the army in prayer because he was the qaid, the leader of the army, and this was his right as a leader. So the Prophet didn't object to that. And number three, he led the prayer without doing the ghusl. And Sayyidina Amr said that he was afraid of making wudu with water. Why? Because of the cold temperature, the water was too cold. He was afraid to use the cold water on his body, his warm body, and it might make him sick, and he might eventually die from that sickness. And the Prophet accepted Sayyidina Amr's rationale, and what he did was correct. That was the Battle of Seerah Lesson, the last major battle before the conquest of Mecca. We also covered the conquest of Mecca. What happened? What led to the conquest of Mecca? Now, we know that from the Muslims had signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah with Quraysh. So this was not really, it was more of a truce with a number of conditions, and one of the conditions was that the people, the Arab tribes would be free to ally themselves with either side, either Quraysh or the Muslim side. So amongst the tribes that allied themselves to the Muslims was Bani Khuza'a, and one tribe that allied themselves to Quraysh was Bani Bakr. In fact, Bani Bakr was probably the only tribe left. The Muslims were not only getting power, but influence, and more tribes were on the side of the Muslims. Quraysh was losing influence, losing power, and probably only a tribe left that was accepted, or was able to, that wanted to have an alliance with Quraysh was Bani Bakr. Now, Bani Bakr and Quraysh had a bad history between each other, Bani Bakr and Quraysh, but they still allied themselves with Quraysh. Bani Khuza'a, on the other hand, they had a good relationship with the tribe of the Prophet, and they allied themselves with the Muslims. Now, Bani Bakr and Bani Khuza'a, at that time, before the conquest of Mecca, they were non-Muslim tribes. Both tribes, they were mushrikeen, both of them. However, Bani Khuza'a, they, as I said, were allied to the Muslims. Now, between Bani Bakr and Bani Khuza'a themselves, there was an old rivalry between the two. They had a history of fighting, killing each other. Bani Khuza'a had killed some people from Bani Bakr. Bani Bakr would take revenge, and then that tribe would take revenge on that tribe, and it would continue on for many years. So after the signing of the treaty, Bani Bakr decided one day to attack Bani Khuza'a, the true tribes at the top. So in the middle of the night, as from the movie The Message, the group of men, armed bandits, attacked a group of people. Now, in reality, those people there, dressed in white, were also non-Muslims. The people on the horses, also non-Muslims, from rival tribes. According to the movie The Message, the people in white were the Muslims, and the people attacking them were non-Muslims, which is a complete fabrication of history. Bani Bakr attacked Bani Khuza'a at night and killed a lot of them, Bani Khuza'a. Not all of them. So many of the Bani Khuza'a, the people in white, fled. Now where did they flee to? They fled to Mecca, because this attack happened near Mecca. They went to Mecca on the assumption that they wouldn't be attacked in Mecca, because Mecca to the non-pagan Arabs was sacred land, holy area land. Nobody people were prohibited from fighting and killing each other in Mecca, especially near the Kaaba. So Bani Khuza'a went all the way into Mecca, up to the Kaaba itself, and Bani Bakr continued running after them, killing them, even in front of the Kaaba itself. Even Quraysh, the allies of Bani Bakr, even assisted them. Not just turned a blind eye, but assisted, helped Bani Bakr to slaughter the people of Bani Khuza'a. Now, Bani Khuza'a, not all of them were slaughtered. Some survived, and some managed to flee Mecca and went to Medina, to the Prophet, to seek the Prophet's help, because the Muslims were their allies. Of course, what happened here? The Prophet, of course, had to take action. Now, the Prophet had to take action, number one, because Bani Khuza'a were their allies. Number two, because he couldn't just let this slip by. He couldn't just allow. This was an attack not only on Bani Khuza'a, because there was an attack on the Muslims as well. Indirect attack on the Muslims, on the Muslim state. So the perpetrators had to be punished. Now, and the Prophet also knew this was the opportunity, the hidden opportunity for the Muslims to gather a big army and march onto Mecca and liberate Mecca, conquer Mecca. Prophet sent out messages to all the allies and the tribes, Arab tribes, to send armed soldiers, men. And he didn't tell them to come to Medina. He told each tribe to send men directly to a place called Qura al-Khamim. Now, Quraysh at the same time are starting to panic. They know the treaty between the Muslims and the Quraysh has been broken. They decide to send Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan is the leader of Mecca, to go all the way to Medina to plead with the Prophet, to please turn a blind eye to this attack or forgive them, and to continue the truce, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So Abu Sufyan arrives in Medina. He when he arrives in Medina, he first goes to the house of Sayyidah Habiba. Habiba was the wife of the Prophet and the daughter of Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan enters the house and he goes to sit down, and his own daughter Habiba tells him to get up, because he was going to lean on a certain cushion that the Prophet used to love leaning on. He said, "No, you cannot touch this cushion. That's the cushion of the Prophet. And you are mushrik, you are unclean, impure mushrik, a non-believer." She's saying that to her own father. Now, this in any other situation, what she did would have been unacceptable for a daughter to say that to her father, but in this particular situation, this was acceptable because of who Abu Sufyan was. He was the leader of Mecca and he was a mushrik. And for him to, and she was showing her father that the Muslims were united, that she wasn't going to break ranks and side and help her father. Abu Sufyan left the house because he was upset, but he went to meet the Prophet himself, to speak to the Prophet, to try and plead with the Prophet, Rasulullah. Rasulullah refused to speak to him, even a single word. Abu Sufyan gets up and goes to speak with Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Prophet's closest companion. Abu Bakr speaks to him and says that basically what you've done is unforgivable, and the Prophet will deal with you. But he wants, Abu Sufyan wants Abu Bakr to go and intercede, to speak to the Prophet, for the Prophet to allow him to come and speak to him, to Abu Sufyan. Abu Bakr refuses to help him. So Abu Sufyan goes to speak to Sayyidina Umar, the second person in command, or the third in command of the Prophet. Sayyidina Umar also rejects Abu Sufyan's request. Abu Sufyan then goes to speak to Sayyidina Ali, the Prophet's own cousin. Sayyidina Ali says the same thing. He refuses to help him. Abu Sufyan is now getting desperate. He's trying to find anybody who will be able to come and speak to the Prophet, intercede on his behalf, to get the Prophet, the messenger, to speak to Abu Sufyan. He's looking around and sees Sayyidina Ali's son, Al-Hassan. He was a little boy. He says, and he's pleading with his mother, Sayyidah Fatima, "Please allow your son to come speak to the messenger." And his mother, the Sayyidah Fatima, also refuses to allow Hassan to do that. Abu Sufyan goes back to Mecca empty-handed. And now they're waiting for what they're not 100% sure what's going to happen, but they know that the Muslims are going to do something. The Prophet will do something to punish them. And as I said, then the Prophet, in secret, complete secrecy, he sends out messengers to all the tribes to gather the troops and to march directly to a place called Qura al-Ghamim, not far from Mecca, only a few kilometers away from outside of Mecca. So he didn't want to gather in a big army and travel with a big army in the desert. He wanted each tribe to send separately, each soldiers, and then meet at the particular point just outside of Mecca. Now the Prophet managed to gather an army of 10,000, and that army appeared almost just all of a sudden, just outside of Mecca. Now this was intentional because the Prophet, number one, wanted a big army to use overwhelming force, and number two, the Prophet wanted as much as possible to reduce any bloodshed in Mecca. So part of it, the big army was part of the effect the Prophet wanted was psychological on the people of Quraysh. Wanted to have a psychological effect on them, for them to think that this army was too big, this Muslim army was too big, too strong for them to resist. They might as well surrender. And this was part of the Prophet's strategy. The army arrived, as I said, just outside of Mecca, and at night he ordered them to light up bonfires, small fires, campfires, hundreds of them all around the mountains around Mecca. Intentional again. If they weren't able to see the whole army during the daytime in the sunlight, at night they'll be able to see hundreds of campfires, so almost surrounding the city. And they'll be able to get an even better idea of how big the army was that was just outside the city. Again, psychological effect, wanted to have a psychological effect on the people of Mecca. As at this time, that Abu Sufyan also decided there was enough is enough, that he was ready to convert to Islam. He went to the Muslims, met with the Prophet in person, and this time the Prophet was happy to speak to him, and he declared his conversion, his shahada, in front of the Prophet. The Prophet, to try and appease him, he said that anybody who takes, because he knew that the Muslims would enter Mecca, he said anybody who takes refuge in Abu Sufyan's house, they are safe. Anybody who takes refuge in their own house, they will also be safe. They will not be attacked. And the next day, the Muslims enter Mecca. That there is a map, and the blue arrows show you the directions of the Muslim army as they entered Mecca. One from this end, one from this end. This was the Prophet's route into Mecca. One here and one down here, which is under the leadership of Khalid ibn Walid. The one that entered Mecca from the south, from here, met some resistance. So Quraysh managed to gather a small army of mostly slaves, and they put up a resistance. They fought against the Muslim army, and of course they were quickly overpowered and defeated. But the two persons who organized that resistance were Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, the son of Abu Jahl, and Safwan ibn Umayyah. Both of those persons would then run away from Mecca, try to escape, because they knew they were wanted men. Because they put up that resistance when the Muslim army was entering Mecca, and they fought and people died. So they were probably wanted, and probably wanted for execution even. And this is Surah Al-Nasr. Everybody would memorized. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. إذا جاء نصر الله. The Nasr is the victory. And the victory is the victory of the conquest of Mecca. And in the end it says فسبح بحمد ربك, glorify Allah, واستغفره, make istighfar, telling the Prophet to make istighfar. إنه كان تواب. Allah is Tawab, He forgives. Now, this is the reason for the one interpretation for this, saying the istaghfir, is for the Prophet to remember that the victory was from Allah, not because the Muslims were powerful, because they had numbers. No, the victory was ultimately only from Allah, and this is to remember. And as the Prophet also when he was entering Mecca, sitting probably on his camel, I think, he was actually bowing down, not sitting up as a conquering king, as an arrogant king. He was showing you he was humble. That was the quick recap. Now, the Prophet, when he entered Mecca, the first thing he did, so the Muslims have taken Mecca now, the Prophet is to enter Mecca. What is the first thing he does? The very first thing, he goes to the Kaaba to destroy the idols in the Kaaba. He breaks the idols of Al-Hubal and whatever. And inside the Kaaba itself, 360 idols, statues, inside the Kaaba itself. Now, this was when the Prophet was living in Mecca for 13 years before the Hijrah. The Prophet was praying towards the Kaaba with all those idols inside, but he never, not once, thought of destroying the statues. Now that he conquered Mecca, he was in control of Mecca. Now he was able to destroy all those statues inside the Kaaba. After he destroyed them, those statues were destroyed, he ordered Sayyidina Bilal to climb up on top of the Kaaba and to make the adhan. Now, This was the second time. In the movie, it was the only time he did it. But in reality, this was the second time Bilal climbed on top of the Kaaba. Does anybody remember when the first time was? The year of the... No, that was the year Prophet was born. So the first time was when the Prophet did perform the Umrah, about one year prior. Or no, 2 years prior. When the Prophet a year prior, yes. When the Prophet and the Muslims did the Umrah, they went, performed Umrah, and that was when the Meccans evacuated Mecca, the people of Mecca evacuated the non-Muslims, and allowed the Muslims to stay in Mecca for 3 days to perform Umrah. It was during that time that the Prophet asked Bilal to climb on top of the Kaaba and to say the Adhan. That was the first time. The second time was the conquest of Mecca itself. And Bilal climbs up again, says the Adhan. While Bilal is saying the Adhan, some of the non-Muslim Meccans are watching, and they are very upset, very unhappy. They're saying, Bilal, he used to be a slave. God gets up on top of the Kaaba, says the Adhan. So one group of people, so it was Abu Sufyan and 2 other people. Abu Sufyan had converted. He was having a conversation with 2 other people. One of them says, look at this black man, he calls him a crow. He's going on top of the Kaaba, and he's being racist, of course, but he's unhappy. And that's one person. Another person says, it's good that so-and-so has passed away. Maybe he's talking about his father had passed away, for him to see such a scene. Abu Sufyan is the third person, and he says, I'm not going to say anything. Why? Because he says that whatever I say, the Prophet is going to know about it. Through the wahy, Jibreel will tell him. So the Prophet approaches this group of 3 people, and the Prophet says, you said this and this, you said this and this. And then Abu Sufyan, before the Prophet continued, said, O Prophet of Allah, I said I didn't say anything. The Prophet, of course, laughs, and he knows that he's telling the truth, of course. But at that point, because the Prophet wasn't part of that group, but he knew the conversation, those 2 other men converted to Islam then and there. How could the Prophet have known what they said? Another group of people as well was also listening to the Adhan, and they're of course upset. One of them was a 16-year-old boy. I don't remember his name, sorry, but he started, because he was known for having a beautiful voice. He's hearing Bilal making the Adhan, he starts imitating him, but mocking him. Allahu Akbar, but saying and trying to say it in a funny way. The Prophet hears him, and he summons him. So this boy is scared now what's going to happen. He knows what he's been doing. He's been mocking Bilal. The Prophet, instead of punishing him, the Prophet, what does he do? He puts his hand on his chest, this boy's chest, and the boy says, all of a sudden, that Iman entered my heart. And at that point, he became the Muazzin. After Bilal, the Muslims left Mecca, this person became the Muazzin because he had a beautiful voice. The Prophet recognized his talent, and now that he was a Muslim, he started making Adhan from then on. And it remained in his family line for a long time, for many generations. Now the Prophet realizes that he's entered Mecca, and he knows that the people of Mecca will probably see him and the Muslims as an occupying force. Even though the Prophet was from Mecca himself, but he'd entered Mecca with an army, he was occupying Mecca. The Prophet was trying his best to win the hearts and minds of the Meccans. He summons them to the Kaaba, and he says to them, what do you expect me to do with you? And they reply, Akhun Kareem ibn Akhun Kareem, you are a noble person, son of a noble person. And the Prophet says, basically says, I will say the same thing that Yusuf said to his brothers. There is no reproachment, no punishment on you this day. You are all free. I forgive you, basically. So Sayyidina Yusuf was in that somehow sort of similar situation. He had been treated badly by his own brothers. His own brothers wanted to kill him, but in the end he forgave his brothers. So Sayyidina Prophet Muhammad did the same thing. He forgave the people of Mecca. And he didn't punish them, he didn't kill them. Now, there are still some beautiful stories of some individual people. As I mentioned, Abu Sufyan, the Prophet, I mentioned the story of Abu Sufyan, how he was, he converted, but also that he was in a group of people. He didn't speak, he didn't want to say anything bad about Bilal. Fudala ibn Umayr. Fudala ibn Umayr was one person. He still had this extreme hatred of the Prophet. And the Prophet was praying at near the Kaaba one time. And Fudala decided to take, I'm not sure if it was a sword or a dagger. His intention was to go near the Prophet and stab him and kill him. He knew that he would probably die himself, but he didn't care. All he wanted to do was to kill the Prophet. And as he approached the Prophet all of a sudden spoke to him directly. He said, "Oh Fudala, what did you think? What are you thinking in your head? What did you say to yourself?" So Abu Fudala just says, "Oh, I'm just here, to pray or whatever." But the Prophet says to him, "Fear Allah." And basically, he's saying to him that I know what you're here trying to do. The Prophet does the same thing. He puts his hand on Fudala's chest. All of a sudden, Iman entered his heart. And Fudala became a strong Muslim after that. He became a very strict Muslim. Prayed a lot and fasted and all that. Suhail ibn Amr. Those of you remember him, he was Quraysh's ambassador during the negotiations at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Suhail ibn Amr was the one who kept objecting. When they were writing the terms of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, now we're going to write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Suhail said, "Who is Ar-Rahman? I don't know who he is." This was a couple of years prior to this. So the Prophet said, instructed Sayyidina Ali, who was actually writing the treaty, change it to Bismika Allahumma instead of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. No problem. And then the treaty is saying the treaty was between Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, and before he could continue, Suhail said, if we had known that you are the Messenger of Allah, we would not have fought against you. All these battles prior. So the Prophet said, okay, change it to Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. This was Suhail ibn Amr. So he was negotiating with the Prophet on the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Suhail ibn Amr also had 4 of his children already converted to Islam. 3 of them had lived in Medina, and the last one he had kept was Abu Jandal, was kept prisoner inside Suhail's home in Mecca. And Abu Jandal had been kept prisoner for a number of years inside his father's home. At the time of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, Abu Jandal managed to escape his captivity in Mecca from his father's house. He went all the way to the Muslim camp to join the Muslims. Unfortunately for Abu Jandal, when he arrived, it was just after this treaty had been signed. And the treaty, according to the treaty said that anybody who wanted to defect to the Muslim side, Muslims had to return him back to Quraysh. So, and just after the treaty. So Abu Jandal arrives, and then Suhail, his father, says, "No, I will not allow my son Abu Jandal to join your side. You have to hand him over to me." Muslims, the Prophet reluctantly handed him over. He had no choice because he had just signed the treaty. Abu Jandal, once his son takes his son, comes near him, he starts hitting his own son in front of all the Muslims. The Muslims became very upset. They're seeing their fellow Muslim being punished, being beaten by his own father, non-Muslim father. Sayyidina Umar, seeing that, was so emotional. He tried his best to get Abu Jandal to take his sword. Umar tried to hand over his sword to Abu Jandal, for Abu Jandal take and struck his own father with it. Of course, Abu Jandal didn't do that. He surrendered to his father and went back home with his father to captivity. So Suhail ibn Amr, after the conquest of Mecca, was remembering all the bad things that he'd done. He had even participated in the battles of Badr and Uhud on the Quraysh's side, fighting the Muslims. He didn't expect himself to even survive. He thought he was going to get executed. But instead, he sent, I think, his son to speak to the Prophet to get some amnesty, from the Prophet. The Prophet simply said, he is safe. I'm not going to punish him or execute him. Suhail comes, but even before Suhail arrived, because he summoned Suhail to come and speak to him, before Suhail arrived, the Prophet instructed the Sahaba around him to not stare at him. He'd even want Suhail to feel uncomfortable because people were staring at him, thinking what a bad person he is. He wanted him to feel at ease. He said, do not stare, just look normally. Don't even stare at him. He comes to the Prophet and he converts, he declares his shahada. And the Prophet accepted his shahada, and Suhail became one of the most important, a very important person in Islamic history. After the Prophet passed away, he had performed one very important thing, very important service for the Muslims. Safwan ibn Umayyah, I mentioned a short while ago, him and Akrimah organized that resistance, the small army of slaves to fight the Muslim army as it entered Mecca. Safwan ibn Umayyah, also, his father was Umayyah ibn Khalaf. Umayyah ibn Khalaf, who used to torture Sidna Bilal, in Mecca. That was his father. His father had died after the Battle of Badr. Sidna Bilal killed him. This was his son, Safwan ibn Umayyah. After the Battle of Badr also, Safwan met one of his friends, Umayr ibn Wahb. Umayr ibn Wahb had participated in Badr. Umayr ibn Wahb, his son, was a captive of the Muslims. Umayr ibn Wahb hatched a plan to kill the Prophet, but he couldn't. He said he was in debt. So Safwan offered Umayr to pay for his family, for his children. He would pay for them till the rest of their lives. Umayr didn't expect it. He was going to go to Medina, kill the Prophet, and he probably would die as a result. Umayr went to Medina, but he in the end ended up converting to Islam. So Safwan ibn Umayyah now has run away from Mecca. His intention was to go and commit suicide by drowning himself in the Red Sea. He would throw himself in the sea and drown and die. He arrives at the seaport, but probably Jeddah, I'm not sure. And he notices someone is following him. Who was following him? His old friend, Umayr ibn Wahb. He was a Muslim, of course, a Sahabi. Umayr ibn Wahb tells him, don't do it. I've come to let you know that the Prophet has assured your safety. He will not punish you or execute you. So Safwan doesn't believe him. He says, I want evidence. So Umayr travels all the way back to Mecca, tells the Prophet what Safwan told him. The Prophet then takes off his turban, hands it over to Umayr. Umayr travels back from Mecca all the way back to probably Jeddah, or the sea, the Red Sea. He meets up with Safwan and tells him the Prophet has guaranteed your safety and amnesty. And he said he's offered you a grace period. He's offering you 2 months of like if you want to think about converting to Islam. He's not forcing him at all. Safwan eventually accepts that, what Umayr said. He travels to Mecca to meet with the Prophet, and he's speaking. When he arrives, he finds the Prophet, but he's at a distance. He's speaking to the Prophet. He said, Umayr has said that you've given me a grace period of 2 months. The Prophet says to him, take 4 months. You think about what you can think about converting or not. It's up to you. In the end, Safwan accepts what the Prophet has said, and he's changed his mind. He's not going to commit suicide. He's going to stay in Mecca, and he's going to think about converting, and maybe convert later. Who knows? Akrimah ibn Abi Jahl was the other person who had organized that resistance in Mecca against the conquering Muslim army. His father was Abu Jahl. Abu Jahl was the former leader of Mecca, and he died in Badr. Akrimah had also had a long bad history of fighting against the Muslims, and he didn't expect the Muslims to, Prophet to allow him to live, but would have him executed. So he also runs away from Mecca. He decides to go to the sea to ride a ship and travel all the way to Yemen to escape the Muslims. He arrives at the ship at the seaport, and he gets on the ship, and the captain of the ship starts arguing with him. The captain of the ship was a Muslim. He says to Ikrimah, you have to convert, Ikhlas, convert to Islam. Well, of course, Ikrimah didn't understand what he meant by Ikhlas, but that's what he meant. So in the middle of that argument, Ikrimah's wife, who was just arrived from Mecca, she had converted to Islam. And she'd also spoken to the Prophet and gotten the Prophet to guarantee his safety. So his wife speaks to him, says to Ikrimah, the Prophet has guaranteed your safety. Do not leave. Come back with me to Mecca. He agrees. He goes back to Mecca and meets with the Prophet face to face, and asks the Prophet to tell him about Islam. The Prophet tells him things that he already knew anyway, to worship only one God, and to pray and zakah and all that. And it was at that moment that Ikrimah was converted to Islam. Ikrimah also would be an important person in the future. He would have participated in battles fighting for the Muslims, and he would die in battle as a shaheed. I think at the battle of against the Romans. I'm not sure which one. Hind bint Utbah, also the wife of Abu Sufyan, she also didn't expect the Prophet to be lenient on her, but in the end the Prophet was lenient, even though she had also had a bad history. She went out with the Qurayshi army at Uhud to encourage the non-Muslims to fight, the Qurayshi army to fight against the Muslims, she and other women. After the Muslims were defeated at Uhud, she and other women were going around mutilating the bodies of the dead Muslims, the soldiers. She had mutilated several bodies, and including Sayyidina Hamza, in which she tried to chew part of his liver, but she wasn't able to. The Prophet, after he conquered Mecca, he was taking that bay'ah, the oath of allegiance, loyalty, allegiance to the Prophet. Not just from the men, from the women as well. And amongst them was Hind. In the end, Hind also converted to Islam, and she had also proved the conversion was genuine. She went out with the Muslim army several times, especially including at the Battle of Yarmouk, to encourage the Muslim army to fight against non-Muslims. Again, another story from the conquest of Mecca was the woman from Bani Makhzum who stole some items. Now the Prophet decreed that her hand should be cut off according to the strict Islamic law. The people tried to intervene on her behalf, and the Prophet rejected any offers of leniency, and her hand was cut off. Now, Bani Makhzum was from the tribe of Abu Jahl, who was the rivals of the Prophet's tribe. They were rivals of Bani Hashim, fighting against them, or against Bani Hashim. Now, in order for people to prevent people from saying that the Prophet wanted to take revenge on a rival tribe, he said that even if my daughter, the daughter of Fatima bint Muhammad, his own daughter, had stolen something, had thieved, he would cut off her hand, meaning that the law applied equally to everybody. He wasn't trying to take revenge on a rival tribe. Bani Khuza'a, you may recall, was the tribe that was allied to the Muslims before the conquest of Mecca. Bani Khuza'a, after the conquest of Mecca, killed a person from another rival tribe in revenge for another killing that happened many years prior. Now the Prophet didn't punish them, but he said we have to pay compensation for this person who was killed. This person they recently killed is an innocent person, even though the person they killed was a non-Muslim. So he organized compensation for the family of that person. The Prophet now appoints a new leader to replace Abu Sufyan, Attab ibn Asid, a 20-year-old. He didn't want to appoint Abu Sufyan to continue leading Mecca. He wasn't 100% sure about whether perhaps Abu Sufyan might change and might go against the Muslims when the Muslim army leaves. But to appease him at the same time, he appointed someone from the same tribe as Abu Sufyan, the tribe of Bani Umayyah. So this is Attab ibn Asid, someone the Prophet trusted. One last thing, after the Muslims conquered Mecca, the Ansar, the people of Medina, who'd accepted the Muslims when they immigrated from Mecca to Medina. The Ansar, the Muslims from Medina, were afraid. They were speaking amongst each other. They were afraid that the Prophet, now he has come back home to Mecca, his original home, he was going to move back to Mecca. The Prophet found out about this. He said, he assured them he was not going to move back to Mecca. Many years prior, he said that he was amongst them. He was a part of them now. He left Mecca. He moved to Medina. He's now living amongst them. He wasn't going to leave them. And this was his pledge to them. Oops. Okay. There was one last thing, but if you want to, we can either take a stop for today, or we can talk about the Battle of Hunayn quickly. Can we continue? Yes? Sorry? Next time? Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Thank you very much. Yeah, really?